Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this policy exchange event on the big society and how Labour should respond to it. It's brilliant to see so many here when we're going head to head practically with the new leader's speech, but I promise we will finish up by quarter past and you can all go away and watch it. We have two people who are really, I suppose, are the big society, I would say. They are the people doing this on the front line. We have Bubb, who is the Chief Executive of ACEVO, which in turn is the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations. He also has all kinds of other roles in building the big society. He's the chair of the social investment business, and he has a big background in the trade union movement. And very kindly, ACEVO, together with ACEVO, are making this event possible, so thank you for that. And David Kester is the Chief Executive of the Design Councils, who are, again, doing all kinds of interesting projects on the ground, making community action a reality. He has a background in all kinds of environmental charities. So without further ado, we're going to have two contributions to kick us off from the front, and then we're going to have as much time for Q&A as we possibly can. Big society is an undefined concept, in my view, at the moment. To some people, it means the kind of reform of public services like the Free Schools Project or the accountability of the police. For other people, it's about nudges and trying to get people to reduce the demand for government by getting people to do things for themselves. And for other people, it's about the role of what, in a terrible phrase, has become known as the third sector, or I prefer to call charities and voluntary groups, doing things for themselves and strengthening their role and allowing them to do more. But it's an undefined concept, and it's certainly not one, even though the phrase big society is associated with David Cameron, the idea of voluntary action is not exactly an alien concept in the Labour Party. An undefined concept, and still one that's going to be argued about between different political leaders, and a very timely thing to be talking about. So, Stephen, if you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you, and I completely agree about the points that you make on big society being an ill-defined concept, and that, in a sense, is a problem and also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to try and define it ourselves. And the question, big society or big state, well, the obvious answer to that, of course, it is neither. And what last week I gave a lecture which was looking at the roots of our charity sector in this country, which has a long and tremendous history. But what that history shows is that there has always been a dual role for the third sector in this country, and it's always been about working with the state. For many centuries, of course, it was charities that delivered public services and not the state. But there was a close relationship between the state and charities, and at one stage it was actually completely impossible to tell the difference between what was a charity, what was the church, and what was the state. Now the roles have changed over time, but essentially there has still been a partnership. Interestingly, when we now look at the debate around big society and we start debating what is the role of charities and social enterprises in delivering both better services and acting as a voice, which is also an essential part of what we do, and then the role of the state, well, the boundaries are changing. I've likened the big society to a long piece of string on which the government's hanging all sorts of balloons. Now, some of these balloons are actually well thought, are probably going to fly. Public services and the reform public services is clearly, the trajectory has been set. The government is pursuing a path that was started under Thatcher, given a major boost by Blair, and we will now see a much stronger delivery role for charities and social enterprises. I mean, that's clear, and we know how that is going to happen. But there is a whole other bit of the concept which is around individual responsibility, encouraging giving and philanthropy, and more volunteering, where the concept is in my view, a lot weaker. As we're at the Labour Party conference, I want to say that the Labour Party needs to get a grip on its response to big society. So far, the knee-jerk reaction has been that this is a cover for cuts, and yet there are aspects of this agenda that are very that a Labour government could run with in a very strong way. There are 4 issues I wanted to raise. The first issue is for the Labour Party, they need to understand whether they are on the side of state delivery or on the side of delivery that benefits individual citizens and communities, and they are currently hopelessly divided on that, and they need to decide. That. The other 3 areas and the other 3 problems I see is, first of all, the role of the individual. There is absolutely no evidence for the suggestion, contrary to what Philip Bond has said, that civic participation has dropped since the introduction of the welfare state, that the welfare state crowded out voluntary action. The levels of volunteering in this country are actually quite high, but they are very static. This is despite strong encouragement, including giving lots of money to volunteering initiatives. So if the state is doing less, will giving rise? Highly unlikely, and that's a serious problem for the concept of big society, and why partnership is still incredibly important. Looking at the localism agenda, which I think is a great agenda about empowerment, there is an issue about community of place or community of interest. If you're devolving power to neighbourhoods, you have to understand that there are communities of interest that do not relate to place. So many minority ethnic communities do not relate to a place, they relate to their community. And there is, of course, the issue around what do you do about people with learning difficulties, mental health, etc., that may actually lose out on a neighbourhood approach. That community of interest issue is simply not being addressed in that localism agenda. I'm going to leave it at that, actually.
Okay, some interesting thoughts to start us off. Over to you, David.
Well, my interest in this is as a designer of services, and the Design Council is particularly involved in social entrepreneurialism. So some of you will know, but we've set up social enterprises in the northeast, in Cornwall, in other parts of the country, to actually expressly do what the big society claims to be about, which is provide an opportunity for local communities to highlight the things that matter to them and get involved in influencing and even actually designing and improving their services. On the basis, and our starting point, and we've been working on this really since about 2004-05, has been that actually that's the way also that business is working, that actually the public themselves as consumers are redesigning their own services. We see that through music publishing, through film, through so many forms all around us. So our view has been that this is absolutely the way that communities, society at large is actually going. So we were obviously very naturally very interested when the whole notion of big society was launched onto the political arena. And I'm very interested in actually looking at the fine print at the moment. Well, what in reality does the coalition government and Lord Way in particular, who's been leading this, actually mean by big society? Now, I'm not going to go through the whole treatise, but to paraphrase a little bit, because some of you may know, we've just finished organising a short series of seminars with Lord Way and others to give an opportunity to share some of the philosophy as it stands at the moment. And actually, if anybody is interested, the slides from Lord Way, which explain his perspective and how he sees big society, and he actually has it fully worked out there, are available off our website. You can download his presentation, his Cabinet Office presentation on big society. But the thesis, in short, the interesting thing is people say, well, actually, you can interpret it whichever way you want, but actually, he's got a very simple one-liner on what big society means. He says it is to give increased power to people to solve problems closer to where they live. I think that's quite simple, actually, and that's a very straightforward concept. He goes on, and I won't go through the whole thing, but he goes on to say that there are three key priorities for big society. One, which is people being more involved in their communities. So exactly as Steve was saying, membership, civic action, charitable giving. He gives lots of examples like Time Bank and other examples too. He talks about the importance of people contributing towards a stronger social sector, with, in fact, examples of ACEVO, NCBO, but also other membership organisations, National Trust. This is very much about scalability, organisation, operational, funding of activities. And finally, he talks about the role of big society in providing people with the opportunity to shape policy. And here he also gives examples from recent years, things like NHS choices, direct gov, things that we know well. And he says, well, these are very good examples of what's already in the public domain where this is actually working. And he talks about the role for government, that the ministers have to promote, catalyse, and very importantly, promote consistency, which I thought was very interesting, particularly in the context of austerity, that actually they want to see, well, you know, policymakers need to promote consistency. So I think that there's no surprise that, certainly after we'd had our first seminar, the blogs, the policy blogs, were alive with people saying, I completely agree. It was very interesting reading Matthew Taylor's blog on that very same day when Lord Way spoke, and he embraced big society, saying that this is absolutely in keeping with what the RSA stands for. And as I mentioned at the Design Council, you know, we've been pioneering this sort of community-led innovation for some time. You know, one example of that that came from one of the projects was in Alzheimer's care, where a local community in the northeast and a local membership or division of the Alzheimer's Society worked with sufferers of Alzheimer's and identified new ways to treat those that community through an idea called Alzheimer's cafes and a number of different tools that they developed. They put those forward to the Alzheimer's Society. At the time, the National Alzheimer's Strategy was being worked on. It entered the mainstream, and that's been rolled out across the country, but through the Alzheimer's Society, not in some other mechanism. So very much a third sector, a big society approach. So my view, and I speak, as I said, not as a policymaker here, but very much as somebody involved in social entrepreneurialism, is this could be a very momentous moment, potentially. You know, maybe this is a sort of Damascene moment for government. It could, of course, as we all understand, be a rather dangerous ploy, because it could set the cause of community innovation back many, many years if it's badly done, or if, as has been hinted by Stephen, it gets confused with cuts. Now, if it's progressive, then it will create more civic engagement. It will deliver better innovation, improvement in services, will deliver better productivity, so value for money for all of us. It could be a very, very powerful legacy for Britain. So on that basis, I'm very excited, and particularly when I read what's written on the tin. On the other hand, if it does become a byword for cuts, cheap outsourcing, then it will be a retrogressive idea, more, I think, akin to the Victorian principles of charity rather than the 21st ideas of charity. So my view, purely as I said, as a designer, is I think that the notion is good, and indeed it works, and I don't think that Labour can deny that it works, because actually they've been very involved in these sort of activities for a number of years in power. But now, perhaps, the role for an opposition is to hold the feet to the fire and to actually really ask the question, is this going to deliver? And police it very thoroughly so that it does actually deliver what it says on the tin.
Very good, thank you very much. So, some interesting insights into the theory and into the practice there. Questions, observations, disagreements. And from all of you, if you could just tell us who you are and where you're from, that would be brilliant. There's a gentleman there in the...
My name's Andy Thornton, I'm the Chief Executive of the Citizenship Foundation. Sat with Lord Way last week discussing these things, and also with a civil servant in the CLG. The thing that's at the same time as developing these ideas, the current government is also plotting to get away with citizenship education as a statutory subject in schools. In other words, the very thing that would resource all young people to understand what the state might provide and their rights and their entitlements to a fair society, to services, all these kind of things are taken away. So that on one hand, the democratic nature of big society is being undermined, in my view. On another hand, the elevation of social leaders, not social cooperation, because social enterprise is different from charities. It's about individuals, leaders coming up with ideas. And that Way told me one of his great ideas for schools, to start working in schools. And without too much self-aggrandizement, I said, yeah, I had that idea 3 years ago and pitched it to a trust. Well, we were statutory, where we were partners, strategic partners of the Office of the Third Sector. There is a degree of badging of stuff that's been going for a long time, but a subtle filtering towards social enterprise, kind of conservative values based around individuals who are startling, taking leadership, as opposed to everyone being developed on the ground, and everyone's capacity for inclusion and participation being developed on the ground. And I'm concerned that there is something going to happen here, which people like yourself, with all the greatest respect, maybe wonderful minds, that think this is a great new idea, this is a great new vanguard. At the same time, people have been doing this in the old style, which in that way was fairly explicit with me. He saw us as the Microsoft and him the Apple. We're the old, and yet we had the same ideas quite a while ago. And I would really want to appeal that people keep an eye on this, because there's something, could be quite seditious in one way, about this not being of the people.
Okay, let's take a couple of things together. There's a gentleman right at the back there, and then we'll come to a lady here.
Hi, Paul Martin from the Lesbian and Gay Foundation. Stephen, you can add lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people to communities of interest as you were talking about. And I'm in a place at the moment where I'm hugely conflicted, and part of me is very, very, very optimistic, and the other part of me is kind of very, very worried and not a little angry, really. And I think that my big issue, of course, is sustainability over the next couple of years to take advantage of the rhetoric and the potential and opportunities presented by big society. And I think that possibly by default rather than design, what we're going to see is we're going to see great swathes of regional-based organisations or medium-sized organisations like mine either greatly reduced or just disappearing altogether. And I mean, there's a couple of points really that are interconnected. I mean, the point that you mentioned, David, about Lord Way saying that this is about power being sort of like, going down to the lowest level or to sort of like to people closest. Does that power also include investment? Because I'm not hearing that actually any investment is going in to sort of like, for people to utilise that power at the local level. And of course, there's a massive great contradiction running through the heart of big society, or elements of big society, in terms of the right to bid and the right to information that's being given to our citizens, but then of course the massive rate cuts that are being taken by the public services. And we're going to have lots and lots of situations where walk-in clinics and a whole range of other sort of like services that people value in their locality are being cut out for cuts and cost measures, cost efficiency measures in localities, and then organise people at the local level challenging those. And there's no blueprint in terms of how that moves forward. But the key issue, I suppose, for me is that, I mean, I don't really understand why, not that I was expecting the voluntary community sector, third sector, call it what you will, being given sort of like a free pass, but to sort of like, you know, have the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago saying that actually, you know, the advice of public services will be kind of cut third sector organisations last, and then Basak following that up with the Treasury almost immediately saying, actually, no, you know, no one's safe, there's no get out of jail free cards to be offered. When of course at the heart of the NHS reforms, the GPs are actually being protected, and the money that's going to GPs will be protected. And I think that one of the things that is starting to infuriate me is the way that the NHS is engaging with the GPs and talking to them about the big role that they're going to play under the NHS reorganisation. And yet, of course, that we as a sector are not being perceived in the same kind of way. I mean, we are worth many hundreds of millions of pounds across the country as a sector, and yet we're not engaged with it the same way or with the same kind of like, you know, respect at the local level. So apologies if my points are sort of like a little bit all over the place, but they kind of come to the central point for me, which is about survival of organisations like mine that provide services that actually are working at the moment across a regional level, because that's the best way for us to kind of get cost efficiency and cost effectiveness in terms of working with communities of interest. All of those structures being dismantled and taken out of the equation, and actually working at the local level. Everybody wants sort of like, you know, an LGBT or T perspective, as they will do with other equality strands around the table, but no one has actually kind of got any funding to kind of like finance that. So it's that really impossible scenario that we kind of find ourselves in terms of trying to think about how to survive before we can take advantage of the big society agenda.
Let's take just one last question in this round, and then we'll get some answers and then come back. So it's the lady there.
Yeah, I suppose I think what's being echoed is really a conflict, really, about, as Stephen and everybody else has said, about there are huge opportunities for local authorities that we work with. Sorry, I'm Emily Holzhouse, I'm from Carers UK. Local authorities that we work with are literally throwing things up in the air and saying, how on earth can we do things differently? I don't know whether anyone's looked at Lewisham's website, but they had a very interesting questionnaire on there asking local citizens what they wanted to cut, and then asking actually, well, would you be willing to actually do these things? Would you actually be willing to clean the streets, carry out social care? So I'd be very interested to see what comes out of that. But I think there are opportunities. We will see development of new services. There will be opportunities, as Stephen says, but also huge retrenchment and loss of diversity in our sector potentially. And a lot of our organisations have all been started up by passionate people with energy and foresight and determination, and they've started because there's a real need. And I think there's going to be a time lag between things that are cut and then the things that grow up after that, because they have to, but they will not be able to do certain things. And I think our fit with the public services is so important. It would be interesting to see what you think about that as well, because there is a limit between what a small community organisation can do in terms of supporting older people in a community who might be lonely and hesitating and isolation, and a service which gets somebody out of bed every morning, washes and dresses them. That's not done by volunteers. I mean, to what extent do you think that needs to be really made very clear in terms of the boundaries around the big society about what it is and what it's also not?
Interesting. So you've got a couple of things there. You've got sort of a question about its democratic character. You've got this big question that's emerging about, you know, what happens when you take lots of money out of the charitable sector, and this point about where it sits, its priority among all the kind of spending objectives. Do you want to go first on this one?
Well, I suppose the thing that I find quite interesting is to try to understand, and I'm sure there are others in the room here who will be much better at this than me, but it seems that there's been shift over the decades post-war to, we started post-war with welfare state and I suppose big state. We then, I suppose, we moved into a position under Thatcherism where that was all sort of breaking up the state and privatisation. And under the last government, we had a narrative which was about devolution and about actually passing on powers from the centre out. Now that was actually a very powerful move, and in many cases actually proved extremely successful. I think we could probably also say that actually when you look at, if you look actually at the record, it was both Thatcherism and, curiously, the Blair-Brown government was still very centrist governments. And so one question, I suppose, here is actually, is this actually the natural progression anyway? Are we actually, is this the right way to go? Is this actually the natural way to go? Is this actually what people actually want? So I think that's one question that I'm quite interested in asking you, and I'm sure there'll be other people here. But on the point of investment, I think we're all very clear. I mean, certainly those of us who've been involved in the redesign of services and the development of services, you can't do these things without proper investment. It doesn't do the involvement of the third sector, charities delivering, local people more involved. These things they're not necessarily cheaper. They may be better. And there may be savings when you look at whole life cycle issues. So if you can, of course, I mean, for instance, we've been working on issues of infection control, which actually, interestingly, Lord Way mentioned, because it's a very topical issue that people care about a lot. Now, when we worked on that, we worked with local patient groups, nurses, doctors, and so forth, and developed new ideas and new solutions which have been implemented. Now, one of the advantages of the methods that they were implemented was that, of course, you can reduce what is actually $1 billion cost to the taxpayer, and also, of course, all of the human suffering as well, 5,000 deaths a year and so forth. But also, in this case, private enterprise gets involved, it can generate revenues, jobs, and so forth. So you can say, yes, the taxpayer ultimately can become a winner. But it doesn't happen without investment, and it also doesn't happen without actually calculating the whole life cycle costs in a different way to the way that, unfortunately, we're familiar with doing. And I don't see that actually at the moment changing. We're still looking at things in their silos, so until we actually start to calculate them in very, very different ways, we won't be able to actually understand the benefits of the state anyway.
Quite. I mean, I would plug a little bit of work that we've done in voluntary adoption agencies, for example, on that. So local councils think that they are much cheaper than the voluntary adoption agencies. The government's own research shows that this is wrong. It also shows that the success rate for the voluntary agencies is 5 times higher than for the state-run services. Yeah. Think about the lifetime costs of someone getting adopted, or not getting adopted, rather than doing it. And, craziness. But Stephen?
Well, there's always a role for romantics and mystics, particularly when you're developing new concepts, and I put Nat Way very firmly in that category. And the problem with romantics is they tend to be a little less au fait with sort of the machinery of government, and they also tend to sort of think that we're working from year zero, and that that is a real problem, because if you analyse some of the work around the proponents of big society, they see it very much as an individual agenda. This is about individual responsibility, individual citizens. They do not see it as a collective agenda.
Really?
No, and they do not see the organised third sector, community, whether it's community organisations, national organisations, as really part of that. It's almost like that we've been parked at the side, and it's because we're sort of slightly tainted. We've become rather bureaucratic. That way talks about bureaucratic charities, for example, and I think that's a real problem, because it is missing a huge opportunity. You are not going to get community empowerment without well-developed, resourced community organisations. And a number of people in the Conservative Party got hold of they discovered Saul Alinsky and his work on community organisation, but they only got to chapter 2, because Saul Alinsky was not talking about individuals. He was talking about community organisations and collectives. That's what absolutely he was talking about. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is as the point's being made, is that the organised sector is going to be very vulnerable to very significant spending deficits, and yet actually that's the sector you need to invest in to encourage growth. So your point about we're going to see a lot of this. National programmes, national organisations, national charities were actually doing this work very effectively, actually losing out because of the move to the move to localism, and that in a sense is my worry. And I've not yet seen how they will marry the collective of the power of the sector and encourage the power of the sector to work to develop the community empowerment. If you don't do it, I mean, the Big Society Network, let me give you one example of this. The Big Society Network has made no contact with the organised sector, actually rejects working with the sector. And they organised a town hall tour, which has now stopped, because they found that actually going around trying to encourage people to do more volunteering, when actually people were coming along and saying, look what's happening to my organisation, and the cuts that are happening in how do you think we're going to get more volunteers? Because they had no answer to that. So I mean, perhaps I'm being very harsh here. And
no, it's interesting. It's interesting that it's that's your take on it. There was a whole bunch of other questions, so we'll have to go have sort of quick fire questions. There are two ladies here. We'll start with you and then move to the row behind you, and then there's a gentleman right in the middle who's been extremely patient.
So, I mean, I think we're all saying that, or all of you seem to said that the big society has a lot of potential, especially for maybe promoting social enterprise and realistic solutions in the community. But what I'm curious about is if 73% of British people give to charity and 29% only volunteer, I mean, surely for the big society to work, you need people to have more time to volunteer. So
okay.
I'm curious about maybe we should do something like reduce working hours or think about doing things like that.
Interesting. And there's a question behind you.
Margaret Lally, British Red Cross. I mean, the big society, I suppose, for us already seems to exist in some ways. We spend quite a bit of time teaching people first aid, for instance, which I think is one of the greatest ways people can help each other apart and save a life. So I suppose I suggest that it isn't all new stuff which isn't happening already. But the bit I haven't really heard about is how we ensure that the big society does empower the most disadvantaged to influence services, because surely that has to be what it's all about. I mean, there's no evidence actually that the middle classes and people who are relatively affluent can't influence services. The whole question has been how do you ensure that people who are more vulnerable, whether because of illnesses or because of lack of education or financial resources, what's going to be put in place to actually enable those people to influence services at a local level.
Okay, and gentlemen.
I feel like computer and tidy. I came in with Peter Shaw's in an urban area act in sort of early 1980s, and we have had a whole succession of governments trying to crack this same problem, which is how at the interface between local government and the physical neighbourhood and communities do you actually get an active engagement. Two things which are really troubling me about the big society, which haven't really come up, I think, yet. One is this whole business that it sits alongside a sort of ideological push for localism, and that we centrally, nationally won't tell people what to do. It's up to everybody locally to work that out. And that takes you straight into the challenges that local authorities, which is the sector I know most about, are facing at the moment, of how do they deliver services in a way that is more efficient, but at the same time is more accessible to individuals, communities, residents to be engaged with. And the second point really is that we all know that communities and volunteering requires trust and it requires time. And what we get is every few years we get the whole policy agenda thrown up nationally, and it takes that 5 years or so for locally for people to work out how to adapt to it, how to make it work, just in time for the next big change. And Labour were just as guilty of this as any other party. And so whilst I think a lot of the thinking is absolutely spot on, as the speakers were saying earlier, the actual reality of delivery of it all is so confused and against a background which is going to, on the one hand, quite a lot of the players are going to get squeezed or shut, have to shut down. We can see that happening. Local authorities are not equipped really to deal with this at the moment, and central government is saying, over to you chaps. So that's where I sort of welcome the take of the panel really, because I want to see it work, but I just feel it's got an awful lot of challenges to it.
Now, was there any last questions? I thought there was one other hand, maybe not. No? Okay, so you've got some interesting different questions there. What about, is it all just about money? It's also about time. Can we liberate more of people's time? Relates to something I'm very interested in. What else can central government give beyond money? Is it buildings, volunteers, data, all those kind of questions? You've got a question there about how does it empower people who are not your typical middle class community organiser, and the questions about how it sits ideologically and how it fits with the push for localisation. Stephen, I'll go to you first on this.
I suppose the final point I make, I guess, for those questions is I do strongly believe that this agenda will only work if there is a partnership approach between the state and between the citizens, communities and third sector organisations. And the partnership is very well illustrated, I think, by the volunteering issue. I think just if it was the case that the state simply withdrew and expected more people to do more things, then that wouldn't happen, because you say organisations, you talked about trust, for example. Well, actually, in terms of ramping up volunteering, it also needs to be organised. And actually, so supporting the organised collective third sector, whether nationally or locally, will be crucial, and the state needs to do that and not withdraw from investing in us.
Well, a few points. Firstly, on the issue of fairness and reaching disadvantaged communities. Firstly, I'm very interested, and I want to watch very closely this new distinction that seems to be emerging around the word fairness and egalitarianism. And I'm not really sure. It worries me. On the one hand, I can understand why we're having that conversation, but if we actually reinvent the word fairness to mean unfair, that would be a terrible thing. So, but actually, Will Hutton, I think, has just written a new book on this, and I think it would be very interesting. I think there's actually a big debate to be had in the context of big society on what actually is, what we mean by fairness in a modern world. Then, I think, secondly, on the volunteering point, I think that's a really, I think from what again, back to what has been said, about what's been written on the tin, I think that the issue of volunteering is only one aspect of this notion of a big society. So I think it shouldn't be overplayed, because I think, and it would be dreadful if we really assumed that actually, emptying the bins was actually going to be a volunteering sort of thing, and actually had to, to have a whip around your street to find out who was going to do it that week on a rota. It's not going to happen, is it? But I think your point about actually engaging with the private sector, or thinking about ways that we work, and the time that we give, and so forth, all of those positive things. Actually, a huge number of employers do that anyway. And my team at work, other employers, a lot of them encourage volunteering and play an active role in their local communities and so forth. So I think a lot of that is happening anyway.
And is there a way to get more of it?
Well, I'm sure there is, and I think that actually that would be a very positive thing, because actually, curiously, in the context of fairness, that might be a very, very good way of distributing time around the place. So I think that that's actually a very interesting idea. I do actually think that the onus in the context of how you engage with communities, the onus is actually on those who are delivering services, and also on policy makers as well, because ultimately it's about developing the skills and the ability, the capability, that is all about engaging with communities and delivering services in new ways. And this is something actually that I know we can say, well, we've been doing it for a long time, but I think we also know that it's actually very, very hard to do, to design really good services around people, and ultimately it isn't about throwing the book over and saying, can you just design my service for me? It's actually often, as we find as design teams, it's often actually about working it's not about town hall meetings, it's not about working with hundreds and thousands of people, it's often actually about working with small groups, it's often about actually working with people on the fringes, and finding out what the extreme behaviours are, and then actually finding out where the really interesting insights are that can improve the whole service for everybody. So this is then about the skills and the capabilities to design and deliver services around communities and with them. And back on that final point of one size fits all, I think there's always that tension. And actually, if you ask most business people, and interestingly, I've been involved in conversations because we do a lot of work with the NHS, and a lot of large institutions desperately want to drive one size fits all because, Apple don't deliver different services all around the world. Actually, they try to work out the optimal way to deliver a service to their customers, and then they deliver it in a completely uniform way everywhere. The thing for them is that they're not really interested in reaching disadvantaged communities and people who, for instance, can't use a computer. I mean, they might have a CSR agenda on the side. That's not their main agenda. So when you're delivering local services, you've got a very, very different starting point.
Very good. Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time here. I should thank again ACEVO and also CB Miller for making this discussion possible. And thank all of you for your brilliant questions. Really, really interesting and sparky discussion. I have lots of notes to go away and try and complete my thing on what on earth the big society is. But Stephen and David, thank you very much. You've both been great. And thank all of you for coming. Cheers.